The Indochina Wars were a series of wars fought in Southeast Asia from 1946 until 1989, between Communist Indochinese forces against mainly French, South Vietnamese, American, Cambodian, Laotian and Chinese forces. The term Indochina originally referred to French Indochina, which included the current states of Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia. In current update use, it applies largely to a geographic region, rather than to a political area. The wars included: the First Indochina War began after the end of World War II in 1945 and lasted until the French defeat in 1954. After a long campaign of resistance against the French and the Japanese, Viet Minh forces had claimed a victory after Japanese and Vichy French forces surrendered in the north on 15 August 1945. In the war in Vietnam, British forces temporarily occupied the south, starting from 13 September 1945, only to restore French colonial control in 1946. In the United Nations and through their alliance with the United Kingdom and the United States, the French demanded return of their former Indochina colony prior to agreeing to participate in the NATO alliance opposing Soviet expansion beyond the countries of the Warsaw Pact in the Cold War. The Communist, nationalist Viet Minh, whom the Allies had supported during the war, continued fighting the French with support from China and the Soviet Union, ultimately forcing the NATO-backed French out of Indochina. The Second Indochina War began as a conflict between the United States-backed South Vietnamese government and its opponents, both the North Vietnamese-based Communist Viet Cong and the People's Army of Vietnam, known in the West as the North Vietnamese Army. The conflict began in the late 1950s and lasted until 1975, where the North Vietnamese came to a peace agreement ending the war. The United States, which had supported France during the First Indochina War, backed the South Vietnam government in opposition to the National Liberation Front and the Communist allied NVA. The North benefited from military and financial support from China and the Soviet Union, members of the Communist bloc. Fighting also occurred during this time in Cambodia between the US-backed government, the NVA, and the Communist-backed Khmer Rouge, and in Laos between the US-backed government, the NVA, and the Communist-backed Pathet Lao. The Third Indochina War was a period of prolonged conflict following the Vietnam War, in which several wars were fought. The Cambodian Vietnamese War began when Vietnam invaded Cambodia and opposed the genocidal Khmer Rouge regime. The war lasted from May 1975 to December 1989. The Sino Vietnamese War was a short war fought in February-March 1979 between the People's Republic of China and the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. The Chinese invaded Vietnam as punishment for the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia, and withdrew a month later to pre-war positions. Skirmishes along the border would continue until 1990. After the triumph of the Pathet Lao, an anti-communist insurgency in Laos lasted until most Hmong insurgents surrendered in 2007. Though some resistance cells remain active, Thailand, which supported the Lao insurgents, as well as the anti-Vietnamese forces in the Third Indochina War, fought a few skirmishes with Vietnam in 1984, and a short conflict with Laos in 1987. The Communist Party of Thailand fought an insurgency from 1965 to 1989. They received backing from Laos and Vietnam from 1975 to 1979, however were expelled from their bases and lost most of their supply lines after they sided with the Cambodian Chinese aligned forces, rather than the pro-Soviet Vietnamese and Laotian regimes. French Indochina. French colonization and occupation of the region was a consequence of missionary work of the 16th century, which had resulted in Catholics forming a converted minority. While Jia Long tolerated Catholicism, his successors Min Mang and Tthc were Orthodox Confucians, admiring Chinese ancient culture. They forbid Catholic proselytism, as it was usually the religious arm of colonization, and they resisted European and American attempts to establish colonial trade posts, which France tried to impose against the laws of the country. This was seen by colonial powers as provocative. Confucian isolationist policy led the Vietnamese to refuse industrial modernization, so that they were not able to resist military power of a French invasion. In August 1858, Napoleon III ordered the landing of French forces at Touraine, beginning a colonial occupation that was to last almost a century. By 1884, the French had complete control over the country, which now formed the largest part of French Indochina. It took the Vietnamese people almost a century to expel the last colonial influence in their country, Indochina. During World War II, a continuous thread of local resistance began with Ham Nghi, then to Phan Thanh Phuong, Phan Boi Chau, and lastly to Ho Chi Minh, who returned to Vietnam from France and helped to create the Viet Minh National Independence Coalition in 1941. A founding member of the French Communist Party, Ho Chi Minh had de-emphasized his communist ties and dissolved the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, in order to unite the country. When the Vietnamese famine broke out in 1945, causing 2 million deaths, after French and Japanese colonial administration continued to export food to France in a post-war economy, the Viet Minh arranged a massive relief effort, consolidating popular support for their nationalist cause. Ho Chi Minh was elected Prime Minister of the Viet Minh in 1945. When World War II ended, the August Revolution expelled the Japanese colonial army and gave control of the country to Viet Minh. The Japanese surrendered to the Chinese nationalists in North Vietnam. Emperor Bao Tai abdicated power to the Viet Minh on August 25, 1945. In a popular move, Ho Chi Minh made Bao Tai supreme advisor to the Viet Minh-led government in Hanoi, which asserted its independence on September 2 as the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and issued a proclamation of independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. In 1946, Vietnam had its first constitution. In 1948, France tried to regain its colonial control over Vietnam. In South Vietnam, the Japanese had surrendered to British forces, who had supported the Free French in fighting the Viet Minh, along with the armed religious Cao Tai and Hoa Hao sects and the Binh Xuyen organized crime group. The French reinstalled Bao Tai as the head of state of Vietnam, which now comprised central and southern Vietnam. The ensuing war, between the French-controlled South and the independent Communist-allied North, is known as the First Indochina War. It ended in a resounding defeat of the French colonial troops by the People's Army of Vietnam at Dien Bien Phu, which marked the first time that a European colonial army was defeated in pitched battle. First Indochina War. In the First Indochina War, the Viet Minh, supported by People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union, fought to gain their independence from the French, supported initially by the remaining troops of the Japanese army after its surrender to Britain, also by the French loyalist Vietnamese Catholic minority, and later by the United States in the frame of the Cold War. This War of Independence lasted from December 1946 until July 1954, with most of the fighting taking place in areas surrounding Hanoi. It ended with the French defeat at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu and French withdrawal from Vietnam after the Geneva Agreements. Second Indochina War. The Second Indochina War, commonly known as the Vietnam War, pitted the recently successful Communist Vietnam People's Army and the National Front for the Liberation of Vietnam against United States troops, and the United States-backed ARVN. Because there was no declaration of war, there is much disagreement as to when the war began. but two events commonly cited are the first arrival of United States advisors in South Vietnam in 1955, and open declaration of United States involvement in 1964. During the war, the North Vietnamese transported most of their supplies via the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which ran through Laos and Cambodia. As a result, the areas of these nations bordering Vietnam would see heavy combat during the war. For the United States, the political and combat goals were ambiguous. Success and progress were ill-defined and, along with the large numbers of casualties, the Vietnam War raised moral issues that made the war increasingly unpopular at home. U.S. news reports of the 1968 Tet Offensive, especially from CBS, were unfavorable in regard to the lack of progress in ending the war. Although the 1968 Tet Offensive resulted in a military victory for South Vietnam and the United States, with virtually complete destruction of the NLF forces' combat capability, it was by the intensity of the combats, the contradiction it implied with recent reports of withdrawals of U.S. troops and status of the war, also a turning point in American voter opposition to U.S. support for their Cold War Vietnamese allies. The United States began withdrawing troops from Vietnam in 1970, with the last troops returning in January 1973. The Paris Peace Accords called for a ceasefire, and prohibited the North Vietnamese from sending more troops into South Vietnam, although the North Vietnamese were permitted to continue to occupy those regions of South Vietnam they had conquered in the 1972 Easter Offensive. The North Vietnamese never intended to abide by the agreement. Fighting continued sporadically through 1973 and 1974, while the North Vietnamese planned a major offensive tentatively scheduled for 1976. The North Vietnamese army in South Vietnam had been ravaged during the Easter Offensive in 1973, and it was projected that it would take until 1976 to rebuild their logistical capabilities. The withdrawal had catastrophic effects on the South Vietnamese army. Shortly after the Paris Peace Accords, the United States Congress made major budget cuts in military aid to the South Vietnamese. The ARVN, which had been trained by American troops to use American tactics, quickly fell into disarray. Although it remained an effective fighting force throughout 1973 and 1974, by January 1975 it had disintegrated. The North Vietnamese hurriedly attacked the much weakened South, and met with little resistance. Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, was taken by the PAVN on April 30, 1975, and the Second Indochina War ended. The fighting that took place between North and South Vietnam following United States withdrawal is sometimes called the Third Indochina War. This term usually refers to a later 1979 conflict. However, Third Indochina War. The Third Indochina War, commonly known as the Cambodian Vietnamese War, started on 1 May 1975 when the Campuchian Revolutionary Army invaded the Vietnamese island of Phu Quoc. Vietnamese forces quickly counter-attacked, regaining their territory and invading the Campuchian island of Kauai. In August 1975, Vietnam returned the island of Kauai to Campuchia and both governments started making peaceful noises. But behind the scenes tensions were mounting. On 30 April 1977, Campuchia started attacking Vietnamese villages. In September, 6 divisions crossed the border, advancing 10 kilometers into Tay Ninh province. Angered by the scale of the attacks, the Vietnam People's Army assembled 8 divisions to launch a retaliatory strike against Campuchia. In December, in an effort to force the Campuchian government to negotiate, the Vietnamese forces invaded Campuchia, easily defeating the Campuchian army. On 6 January 1978, Vietnamese forces were only 38 kilometers from Phnom Penh. However, the Kampuchean government remained defiant, and the Vietnamese leadership realized they would not secure their political objective and decided to withdraw their troops. As Kampuchean forces soon resumed their attacks across the border, the Vietnamese launched another limited counter-attack in June, forcing the Kampucheans to retreat. Again the Vietnamese withdrew and the Kampucheans resumed their attacks. Vietnam had enough. In December 1978, Vietnam launched a full-scale invasion. Phnom Penh was captured in January 1979. The ruling Khmer Rouge were driven from power and a pro-Vietnamese government was installed. In 1984, Vietnam unveiled a plan for the disengagement of its army from Campuchia. In 1988, the Vietnamese government began withdrawing forces in earnest. The last men left in September 1989. The Third Indochina War, also refers to the Sino Vietnamese War, was fought in February-March 1979 between the People's Republic of China and the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. Shortly after the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia, the People's Republic of China, who were the Khmer Rouge's political ally, launched a punitive invasion of Vietnam. Fighting was short but intense. The Chinese advanced about 40 kilometers into Vietnam, occupying the city of Lang Son on 6 March. There, they claimed the gate to Hanoi was open, declared their punitive mission achieved, and withdrew.